Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The forgotten trails of the Appalachian Mountains hide stories that have been purposefully buried. Stories that locals only whisper about during cold winter evenings when the wind howls through the pines. In 1919, at the end of the Great War, when America was attempting to return to normalcy, something entirely abnormal was happening in a remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is the documented account of the Mountain Brothers and the travelers who never returned home. Harrison County, West Virginia, 1919. The war had ended, and soldiers were returning to their homes. The country roads were busier than ever with people traveling to reunite with family or searching for new opportunities in the post-war economy. The Spanish flu pandemic that had ravaged communities was finally subsiding, and a sense of cautious optimism had begun to take hold. Rail lines were congested with passengers, and those who couldn't afford train fare took to the roads, often hitchhiking or traveling by foot through the mountain passes that connected the isolated communities of Appalachia. Amid this movement of humanity, reports began surfacing about travelers who departed from nearby towns heading east through the mountain pass but never arrived at their destinations. The official records from the Harrison County Sheriff's Department noted 15 such disappearances between March and October of 1919, though local newspapers suggest the actual number may have been considerably higher. The Clarksburg Daily Telegraph ran a small column on July 12, 1919, noting that the county had experienced an unusual number of transient persons failing to reach their stated destinations, though the article attributed this to the general chaos of post-war movement. The Blackwell Pass, a narrow mountain route connecting several coal mining communities, became known locally as the Vanishing Road. What made these disappearances particularly disturbing was their selectivity. Those who vanished were almost exclusively lone travelers, often those passing through with no strong connections to the local communities, people whom few would immediately miss. The official explanation from local authorities was that these individuals likely fell victim to accidents in the treacherous mountain terrain, or perhaps continued their journeys elsewhere without informing anyone. The public records show that Sheriff Thomas Caldwell officially closed most of these missing persons cases with the notation, "Presumed departed area, no evidence of foul play." However, documents uncovered in 1963 from the private records of Sheriff Thomas Caldwell tell a different story. According to Caldwell's personal journal, found in the attic of his granddaughter's home in Charleston, the sheriff had been tracking a pattern in the disappearances that he deliberately kept from official reports. The journal, which spans from February 1919 to December 1920, details Caldwell's growing suspicion of two brothers who lived in an isolated homestead near the highest point of Blackwell Pass. The journal's leather binding was cracked with age and many pages were water-damaged, but the meticulous handwriting remained legible enough to reveal a disturbing investigation that never made it into official records. Jeremiah and Elias Thornhill were known locally as the Mountain Brothers. The siblings had lived in the area all their lives, inheriting a modest parcel of land from their father, who had been a moderately successful trapper before the turn of the century. According to tax records from 1910, the brothers operated a small rest stop for travelers crossing the pass, offering basic meals and occasionally lodging for those caught in the mountains after sundown. Their establishment was marked on local maps simply as Thornhill Rest, and it appeared in travelers' guides of the era as a modest but adequate waypoint for those crossing Blackwell Pass. Church records from the Mount Zion Baptist Church in nearby Millbrook indicate that the brothers attended services sporadically in their youth but became increasingly reclusive after their father's death in 1908. The pastor's notes from 1911 mention that the Thornhill boys have taken to their mountain ways entirely now, appearing in town only for supplies and offering little in the way of conversation. Tax assessor notes from 1915 describe their property as a main dwelling of moderate size, well-maintained, with 2 outbuildings and approximately 12 acres of cleared land surrounded by forest. What drew Sheriff Caldwell's suspicion was not merely their isolation, but rather reports from those who had encountered the brothers and lived to share their experiences. In his journal entry dated April 17, 1919, Caldwell wrote, "Spoke with Malcolm Reed today regarding his journey through the pass last week. Reed reports that upon stopping at the Thornhill place, he was offered a meal and lodging for the night. He describes Jeremiah as uncommonly interested in his business affairs and destination." When Reed mentioned he was expected in Charleston the following day, the brothers' demeanor reportedly changed. They withdrew the offer of lodging, served him a hastily prepared meal, and suggested an alternate route that would get him to his destination much quicker. Reed, familiar with the area, recognized that the suggested path would have taken him hours out of his way through particularly remote terrain. Reed's account might have been dismissed as an odd encounter were it not for similar reports from other travelers. Caldwell's journal contains at least 4 comparable accounts between April and July of 1919, each describing the brothers' unusual interest in travelers' destinations and their apparent change in demeanor when learning that someone was expected at a specific time and place. An entry dated May 29, 1919, recounts the experience of a traveling salesman named Howard Greaves. Greaves reports that when he mentioned his sales route included regular stops in Clarksburg and Charleston, with associates expecting him on specific dates, the brothers seemed to lose interest in further conversation. They provided directions to shorten his journey rather than offering their usual lodging service, despite the late hour and threatening weather. Local sentiment toward the brothers was a complex mixture of respect and unease. According to an article in the Harrison County Gazette, dated June 3, 1919, the brothers were known for their knowledge of the mountain terrain and medicinal plants. They occasionally provided remedies to locals suffering from various ailments. Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, a longtime resident of Millbrook, was quoted as saying, "Jeremiah Thornhill provided a tincture that cured my husband's persistent cough when the doctor in Clarksburg had all but given up. They may keep to themselves, but there's no denying they know the old mountain ways." However, the same article noted that few ever visited their homestead, and the brothers rarely descended into the nearby towns except for essential supplies. A merchant's ledger from Thompson's General Store in Millbrook, preserved in the County Historical Society's archives, shows the brothers' purchasing patterns from 1917 to 1919. The records indicate bulk purchases of salt, sugar, flour, and preserving supplies, all consistent with a self-sufficient lifestyle in a remote location. What raised questions later, when examined in light of subsequent discoveries, was the quantity of certain items, particularly salt and preserving jars, which seemed excessive for a 2-person household. The situation escalated in late summer of 1919. Caldwell's journal entry from August 29 reads, "Found abandoned wagon approximately 2 miles east of the Thornhill property. Belongs to J. Hamilton, merchant from Clarksburg, reported missing 3 days prior. Horse missing. Cargo of dry goods and sundries gone. Peculiar marking carved into the wagon seat. Appears to be a simple symbol of crossed lines. Second such marking observed on missing person's property this month." The symbol, as described in Caldwell's journal and later sketched by a deputy, consisted of 2 intersecting lines with small marks at each end, resembling a crude representation of a crossroads or junction. Anthropologists who later studied the case suggested it might have been a territorial marking or, more disturbingly, a kind of tally system. The same symbol would later be found etched into several trees along remote paths in the area, all within a 5-mile radius of the Thornhill property. What followed in the journal suggests that Caldwell began a discreet investigation of the brothers, though he was careful not to alarm them. He enlisted the help of Deputy Michael Fitzgerald, who, according to the journal, was sent to the Thornhill homestead posing as a traveler on September 12, 1919. Fitzgerald's report, meticulously transcribed by Caldwell, describes a disturbing encounter. The property consisted of the main cabin, visible from the road, and two outbuildings partially concealed by the surrounding forest. The approach to the homestead was marked by a crude wooden sign that read simply, "Rest, Food, Supplies," and featured a small arrow pointing toward the cabin. Fitzgerald noted that, as he approached, he observed both brothers on the porch, though Jeremiah quickly retreated inside when he noticed the visitor. According to Fitzgerald's report, Elias greeted him warmly, offering water for his horse and suggesting he might want to rest before continuing his journey. Fitzgerald noted that while Elias engaged him in conversation about his travels, Jeremiah disappeared into one of the outbuildings for nearly 30 minutes. The deputy described the interior of the main cabin as surprisingly well appointed for such a remote location, with quality furnishings that seemed inconsistent with the brothers' apparent means. He particularly noted an ornate clock on the mantel that appeared to be of European manufacture, and a collection of leather-bound books that seemed out of place in a mountain cabin. When Jeremiah returned, Fitzgerald observed that he had changed his shirt, though the day was cool and he had not been engaged in physical labor. The brother offered no explanation for the change of attire or his absence. More concerning, Fitzgerald reported hearing what he believed to be movement in the loft above the main room, though the brothers assured him they lived alone. When he casually inquired about the sound, Elias quickly attributed it to settling timbers and directed the conversation elsewhere. When Fitzgerald inquired about the possibility of purchasing supplies for his journey, he was led to a storage shed containing an unusual amount of diverse personal effects, clothing of various sizes, watches, books, and other items one might find among a traveler's possessions. When questioned about this collection, Elias explained that they often traded with travelers who found themselves short on funds, accepting personal items in exchange for food and supplies. Fitzgerald noted in his report that some of the items appeared to be of considerable value, including a gold pocket watch with an inscription reading, "To Thomas on the occasion of 25 years of service, Wellington Coal and Rail, 1917. This matched the description of an item reported missing by Thomas Burnside, a railway employee who had disappeared while traveling through the area in July 1919. The deputy also observed a collection of walking sticks and staffs, numbering more than 20, hanging on the wall of the storage room. When he commented on the collection, Jeremiah mentioned that they crafted them from local wood and sold them to travelers. However, Fitzgerald noted that several appeared well used and personalized, with carved initials or distinctive handles that suggested they had been carried for some time by their previous owners. Perhaps most disturbing was Fitzgerald's account of the brothers' behavior as evening approached. They became increasingly insistent that he continue his journey, despite the late hour, suggesting a route down the mountain that would lead to a small settlement where he could find proper lodging. Fitzgerald described Jeremiah as growing visibly anxious as the sun began to set, repeatedly checking the position of the sun through the window and suggesting the deputy should depart before darkness makes the path difficult to follow. Fitzgerald, following Caldwell's instructions to maintain his cover, thanked them and departed. But instead of taking the suggested path, he concealed himself in the woods near the property. What he observed over the next few hours, as documented in Caldwell's journal, would form the basis for what later became known as the Mountain Brothers case. Approximately 1 hour after sunset, a lone traveler approached the homestead, a man on foot carrying a small rucksack. From his hiding place, Fitzgerald watched as the man was greeted warmly and invited inside. The lights in the cabin remained on for approximately 45 minutes, during which time the deputy, could occasionally see shadows moving past the windows. Then Fitzgerald reported hearing a sharp cry, cut suddenly short. This was followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged. Shortly thereafter, both brothers emerged from the house and proceeded to one of the outbuildings carrying what appeared to be a body wrapped in a blanket. They remained in the outbuilding for nearly an hour, during which time Fitzgerald observed light from what he presumed to be a lantern moving within. When they eventually emerged, they were carrying several buckets, which they emptied into a pit some distance from the main buildings before covering it with soil and pine needles. Fitzgerald returned to Harrison County immediately to report to Caldwell. The journal indicates that Caldwell planned to organize a search of the Thornhill property, but wanted to gather sufficient manpower to ensure the operation's success. A notation dated September 14th states, "Have telegraphed Charleston for additional deputies. Will proceed to Thornhill property when reinforcements arrive, expected Tuesday next. Have instructed all men to approach with caution. If Fitzgerald's observations are accurate, we may be dealing with individuals of dangerous disposition." The journal also includes a hand-drawn map of the Thornhill property based on Fitzgerald's observations, marking the locations of the main cabin, outbuildings, and the pit where the brothers had disposed of the contents of the buckets. Caldwell noted his intention to focus the search on this area, as well as the outbuilding where the wrapped form had been taken. What happened next remains one of the most peculiar aspects of the case. According to both Caldwell's journal and later newspaper accounts, when the sheriff's posse arrived at the Thornhill homestead on September 17th, they found the property completely abandoned. There were signs of a hasty departure, food left on the table, clothing still hanging from washing lines, but no indication of the brothers' whereabouts or destination. Caldwell's journal entry from that day expresses his frustration. Property deserted, no trace of T. brothers, fire in stove coal but wood still present, suggests departure within past 24-48 hours. Question remains as to how they received warning of our approach. This question would never be satisfactorily answered, though later investigation revealed that the telegraph operator in Charleston had a cousin who worked at Thompson's General Store in Millbrook, leading to speculation that word of the impending raid might have leaked through this connection. Another theory, proposed by Caldwell himself in a later entry, suggested that the brothers might have maintained a system of lookouts or informants among the local population, though no evidence ever emerged to confirm this. The subsequent search of the property revealed evidence that shocked even the experienced lawman. The main outbuilding, constructed partially underground in the style of a root cellar, contained a large work area with an assortment of tools, butchering knives, saws, and other implements, all meticulously maintained. Adjacent to this was a smaller room that had been carefully lined with timber to form a crude but effective cold storage. Inside, investigators discovered evidence suggesting the brothers had been engaged in what the journal refers to only as preservation activities. Documents from the Harrison County Courthouse, sealed until 1963, provide clinical descriptions of what was found. Human remains in various states of preservation were discovered both in the cold storage and buried in shallow graves on the property. The official report identified the remains of at least 11 individuals, though due to the condition of some remains, the actual number could not be determined with certainty. The report noted that some remains appear to have been subjected to preservation methods similar to those used in taxidermy, while others were apparently processed in a manner suggesting intended consumption. This aspect of the case was deliberately suppressed in contemporary newspaper accounts, which mentioned only that evidence of foul play had been discovered. The Harrison County Gazette's edition of September 20, 1919, reported simply that authorities have confirmed that the Thornhill brothers, previously of interest in connection with several missing persons cases, have fled their property following the discovery of incriminating evidence. A manhunt is currently underway. The paper made no mention of the grim discoveries at the property, likely due to both the sensational nature of the findings and at the request of Sheriff Caldwell, who, according to his journal, feared that detailed reports might incite panic and hinder the methodical pursuit of the suspects. What makes this case particularly disturbing are the journals found in Jeremiah Thornhill's personal quarters. The journals, spanning nearly 15 years, detail the brothers' activities with a clinical detachment that investigators found more unsettling than any expression of malice would have been. The writings suggest that the brothers viewed their actions not as crimes, but as a form of artisanal craft, referring repeatedly to their preservation work and the perfection of technique. One entry, dated August 3, 1918, reads, "Subject 27 proved most suitable for the new preservation method. The application of cedar oil after the salt treatment appears to prevent the leather-like texture that has been problematic in previous attempts. The result maintains a more lifelike appearance, particularly in the facial features. Elias suggests we should attempt the same method with Subject 28, expected to arrive within the fortnight, according to the stage schedule we obtained in Millbrook." The journals also shed light on the brothers' selection process. They targeted primarily individuals who appeared to be passing through the area, preferably those traveling alone and without clear connections to nearby communities. They would engage travelers in conversation to determine whether anyone was expecting them at their destination and how soon they would be missed. Those deemed suitable would be invited to stay for a meal or to rest. What happened next was documented with disturbing precision in the journals. An entry dated May 5, 1917, provides insight into their methodology. The application of the sedative to the evening meal continues to prove effective. When administered in the proper dosage, 2 measures per cup of coffee, it induces a state of compliance without rendering the subject immediately unconscious. This allows for a more controlled transition to the preparation area. Subject 19 exhibited minimal resistance and was secured in the preservation room within 12 minutes of ingestion. The entire process was completed before midnight, allowing adequate time for cleaning and restoration of the main room before the potential arrival of any morning travelers. The journals reveal that the brothers had refined their process over years of practice, developing techniques for identifying suitable targets, subduing them efficiently, and disposing of any evidence. They maintained detailed records of each subject, including physical characteristics, belongings, and the specific preservation methods used. In some cases, they even kept records of the individual's final statements or expressions, noting these with the same dispassionate attention to detail that characterized all their documentation. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of what the investigators termed the collection. In a concealed room accessible only through a trapdoor in Jeremiah's bedroom, they found dozens of carefully cataloged personal items taken from victims: watches, wedding rings, photographs, letters, and other keepsakes. Each item was tagged with a date and a simple numeric identifier that corresponded to entries in Jeremiah's journal. The collection represented a meticulous record-keeping system that suggested the actual number of victims far exceeded the remains found on the property. Among the items recovered was a leather wallet containing identification papers for William Garfield, a traveling salesman from Ohio who had been reported missing in 1916. The wallet was tagged with the number 14 and contained, in addition to Garfield's credentials, a photograph of what appeared to be his wife and other relatives. A gold wedding band labeled as belonging to Subject 23 was later identified through a distinctive engraving as the property of Margaret Whitley, a schoolteacher from Virginia who had disappeared while traveling to visit relatives in Kentucky in early 1918. The manhunt for the Thornhill brothers continued throughout the winter of 1919-1920, but despite the involvement of law enforcement from multiple counties and even federal agents, they were never apprehended. Caldwell's journal documents his growing frustration as leads went cold and sightings proved false. An entry from November 18, 1919 reads, "Another reported sighting in Morgantown proves unfounded. The description matched, but upon investigation, the men in question were identified as miners recently arrived from Pennsylvania." I fear the brothers have found refuge in the deeper wilderness areas where law enforcement presence is minimal or non-existent. Sightings were reported as far away as Tennessee and North Carolina, but none could be confirmed. Some reports suggest that the brothers may have separated, using different identities to evade capture. The physical descriptions circulated to law enforcement agencies described Jeremiah as approximately 45 years of age, 5'11" in height, slight build, dark hair, graying at the temples, with a notable scar on his left forearm, while Elias was described as approximately 40 years of age, 6'2" in height, sturdy build, full beard, walking with a slight limp in the right leg. A telegram in Caldwell's possession, dated November 30th, 1919, from authorities in Asheville, North Carolina, reported the arrest of a man bearing a strong resemblance to Elias Thornhill, but by the time Caldwell arranged to travel there for identification, the suspect had been released due to lack of evidence and had vanished once again. The telegram noted that the man had been working as a handyman at a local inn for approximately 2 weeks before his arrest, and had been described by his employer as quiet, capable, and keeping to himself. After his release, he failed to return to collect his final wages, and inquiries revealed he had been living in a rented room under the name Edward Thomas. Throughout the winter and spring of 1920, the search continued, with Caldwell sending deputized searchers into the more remote areas of the Appalachian Range based on reports from hunters and trappers. A notation in the journal dated January 8, 1920, mentions that informant Wilson reports finding an abandoned camp approximately 30 miles southeast of the original Thornhill property. Camp contained several personal items consistent with brothers' known possessions, including a distinctive carved pipe identified by Thompson from his store as one he sold to Jeremiah in 1918. Camp appears to have been abandoned approximately 1 week prior to discovery. Have dispatched deputies Collins and Reeves to investigate surrounding area. The last credible sighting of either brother came in April 1920, when a former resident of Harrison County claimed to have encountered Jeremiah working as a butcher's assistant in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. James Whitaker, who had moved from Millbrook to Knoxville in 1915 and thus was familiar with the Thornhills, reported that he had visited a butcher shop and recognized Jeremiah, despite his attempt to alter his appearance by shaving his head and growing a full beard. Whitaker reported that when their eyes met, Jeremiah showed momentary recognition before quickly excusing himself and disappearing into the back room of the shop. By the time authorities investigated, the man matching Jeremiah's description had already departed, leaving no forwarding address or indication of his destination. The shop owner reported that the man, who had given his name as Joseph Thomas, had worked there for only 3 weeks and had left without collecting his final week's wages, claiming a family emergency required his immediate departure. The case took a bizarre turn in October 1920 when Caldwell received an unmarked package at the sheriff's office. Inside was a pocket watch that had been identified in official reports as belonging to one of the presumed victims, a railroad engineer named Howard Phillips, who had disappeared in June 1919. Wrapped around the watch was a note that read simply, "Still keeping perfect time." Handwriting analysis later confirmed it to be Jeremiah's script. The package had been mailed from Johnson City, Tennessee, though investigators believed this was likely a deliberate misdirection rather than an indication of the brothers' actual location. This would be the last known communication from either of the Thornhill brothers. The investigation continued with diminishing intensity throughout 1920 and into 1921. Caldwell's journal entries show his growing resignation as the trail grew colder. An entry from March 1921 reads, "It has been 6 months since the last confirmed communication from J. Thornhill, and over a year since any credible sighting of either brother. While I remain convinced they continue their activities elsewhere, I am forced to acknowledge that the resources available for their pursuit are no longer sufficient, given the lack of fresh evidence." As months turned to years with no further developments, the case gradually faded from public attention. The Thornhill property remained abandoned, with no relatives coming forward to claim it. In 1925, the county seized the land for unpaid taxes. Despite its notorious history, or perhaps because of it, no buyers showed interest. Eventually, the forest reclaimed the clearing, and by the time researchers from the West Virginia Historical Society attempted to locate the site in 1963, nature had almost completely obscured any trace of the homestead. Only the stone foundation of the main cabin and the partial remains of the root cellar could be identified with certainty. Sheriff Caldwell remained obsessed with finding the brothers until his retirement in 1931, keeping a detailed file of reported sightings and potential leads. According to his granddaughter's testimony, given during the Historical Society's investigation in 1963, Caldwell would often spend evenings poring over maps of the Appalachian region, marking potential hiding places and plotting possible routes the brothers might have taken. He never accepted that they had simply disappeared, she recalled. He believed they had found another isolated area where they could resume their activities without scrutiny. He used to say, "Men like that don't stop. They just find new hunting grounds." Caldwell's obituary in the Harrison County Gazette in 1946 made brief mention of his role in uncovering one of the county's most notorious criminal cases, though it provided no details. By then, the Thornhill case had become something of a local legend, with various embellished versions circulating among the residents of the area, many bearing little resemblance to the documented facts. The case might have remained a macabre footnote in local history were it not for a discovery made in 1964 by hikers exploring a remote cave system approximately 12 miles from the original Thornhill property. The hikers, students from Marshall University conducting a geological survey, reported finding what appeared to be the remains of a long-term campsite deep within the cave system. Among the items discovered were cooking utensils, the remnants of a crude bed, and a metal box containing several leather-bound journals. The journals were turned over to local authorities who, recognizing their potential connection to the Thornhill case, contacted the West Virginia Historical Society. Deep within the cave, they discovered what appeared to be a living space that had been occupied for an extended period. The cave's entrance was well concealed by natural rock formations and vegetation, making it virtually invisible unless one knew exactly where to look. Inside, researchers found evidence suggesting that someone had lived there for years, perhaps decades, in almost complete isolation. Among the items found were several journals similar in appearance to those recovered from the Thornhill homestead. The journals contained entries dated as late as 1943 and were written in a hand that experts would later confirm matched that of Jeremiah Thornhill. The cave contained other items as well: crude furniture fashioned from local timber, tools adapted for various purposes, and, most disturbing, a collection of bones that forensic analysis would later identify as human, though they showed signs of having been processed for cooking and consumption. The journals from the cave provide a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a man who had lived for decades as a fugitive, yet continued to view his actions through the lens of craftsmanship rather than criminality. The earliest entries, dated 1920, describe the brothers' flight from their homestead and their initial efforts to establish a new operation elsewhere. However, entries beginning in late 1921 suggest that the brothers had separated, with Jeremiah expressing both resentment and relief at Elias's departure. An entry dated November 17, 1921, reads, "E has gone. Disagreement over methods has made continued partnership untenable. He lacks the patience required for proper preservation, rushing the process and compromising the results. His absence will allow me to pursue refinements without interruption. The cave provides adequate seclusion, though the limited access to subjects necessitates more careful planning." Subsequent entries detailed Jeremiah's adaptation to his isolated existence, describing his methods for luring occasional travelers to the cave and his increasingly elaborate preservation techniques. The writing grows more erratic over time, with later entries suggesting a deteriorating mental state. References to conversations with previous subjects begin to appear, indicating that Jeremiah had begun to attribute personalities and voices to the preserved remains he kept in his hidden dwelling. An entry from 1937 reads, "Number 41 continues to argue against the new method, but he fails to understand the aesthetic principles involved. Number 37 appreciates the improvement, as does number 32. Their guidance has been invaluable in refining the technique. The new subject arriving tomorrow will benefit from their collective wisdom." The final journal contained entries that suggest at least one of the brothers had continued their activities for decades after their disappearance from Harrison County. The writing had become increasingly erratic, with references to the hunger of the mountains and claims that the author could hear the voices of the preserved ones guiding his work. Some passages suggest that Jeremiah had begun to incorporate ritualistic elements into his activities, describing ceremonial preparations and patterns that must be followed to ensure the proper transition from subject to guide. The last coherent entry, dated March 17, 1943, reads, "Elias has been silent for 3 days now. His breathing grows more labored by the hour. The infection in his leg has spread despite the poultices. I have prepared the tools and will begin the preservation process before dawn. My brother will be my finest work. He will join the Council of Guides and complete our collection. The circle closes. The mountain provides." This entry raised numerous questions among investigators. Had Elias actually rejoined his brother at some point, or was this evidence of Jeremiah's delusions? The reference to an infected leg aligned with the descriptions of Elias's limp in earlier documents, suggesting that the brothers might indeed have reunited. However, no definitive evidence of a second occupant was found in the cave, leaving the question unresolved. No human remains were found in the cave that could be definitively identified as Elias Thornhill, though forensic analysis of stains on a wooden table indicated the presence of human blood of multiple types. A thorough search of the surrounding area yielded no graves or other evidence of disposal sites. The ultimate fate of the Thornhill brothers remains unknown, though the journal entry suggests that Jeremiah may have attempted to preserve his brother after his death from what appears to have been a severe infection. The last journal ends abruptly after the March 17th entry, with several blank pages following. Whether Jeremiah completed his final work, as he described it, and then departed, or whether he himself succumbed to illness or injury shortly thereafter, remains a matter of speculation. The condition of the cave suggested that it had been abandoned for many years before its discovery in 1964, with no signs of recent habitation. The legacy of the Mountain Brothers case extends beyond the immediate horror of their crimes. In the years following the discovery of the cave in 1964, researchers identified at least 7 similar cases across the Appalachian region between 1920 and 1950, instances where travelers disappeared and evidence suggested methodical, ritualistic activities reminiscent of the Thornhill's practices. While no direct connection could be established, some criminologists have suggested that the brothers may have inspired copycat offenders, or alternatively, that their isolation might have ended when they found others with similar inclinations. A report prepared by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in 1966 noted, "The Thornhill case exhibits characteristics that anticipate modern serial predator patterns, particularly the methodical selection of victims, the ritualistic processing of remains, and the trophy-collecting behavior." What distinguishes this case from others is the craftsmanship mentality. The brothers viewed their activities as a form of work or art, rather than acts driven primarily by psychological compulsions. This vocational approach to predation represents a unique typology in criminal behavior studies. Dr. Eleanor Westcott, a forensic psychologist who studied the case extensively in the late 1960s, proposed a theory that the brothers may have been part of a larger network. In a paper published in the Journal of Criminal Psychology in 1968, she wrote, "The methodical nature of the Thornhills' activities, combined with the sophisticated preservation techniques described in their journals, suggests knowledge that may have been passed down or shared." The question remains whether the brothers developed these practices in isolation or whether they were initiated into an existing tradition. The geographical distribution of similar cases across the Appalachian region, spanning several decades, raises the possibility of a diffuse network of practitioners sharing techniques and perhaps even territories. This theory gained credibility in 1968 when researchers examining historical records discovered that the Thornhills' father, Ezekiel, had traveled extensively throughout the Appalachian region in the 1870s and 1880s before settling in Harrison County. Records from various communities along the mountain range indicate that Ezekiel had worked variously as a trapper, guide, and occasional undertaker's assistant, the latter role providing him with knowledge of preservation techniques. During this period of his travels, local newspapers from several communities reported unusually high numbers of missing persons, particularly among travelers and itinerant workers. Records indicate that during this period, there were several unsolved disappearances along his known travel routes, though no direct evidence ever linked him to these cases. A researcher at the West Virginia Historical Society noted in a 1968 report the pattern of disappearances that followed the Ezekiel Thornhill's movements through the Appalachian communities between 1872 and 1885 bears striking similarities to those later associated with his sons. While circumstantial, the evidence suggests that the practices documented in Jeremiah's journals may represent a continuation of activities initiated by the father. This intergenerational aspect of the case adds a particularly disturbing dimension to an already horrifying narrative. The notion that such practices could be taught and passed down like a family trade challenges conventional understanding of deviant behavior and raises questions about the role of isolation and cultural disconnection in the development of extreme antisocial activities. The Mountain Brothers case represents a disturbing chapter in the hidden history of the Appalachian Mountains. The isolation offered by the rugged terrain, combined with the transient nature of many who traveled through the region during periods of economic migration, created conditions where the brothers could operate undetected for years. The case serves as a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling threats are not supernatural entities, but the quiet predators who move among us, watching and waiting for the vulnerable to cross their path. What adds a final unsettling dimension to this case is the fact that despite extensive investigations in the decades following the initial discoveries, authorities could never account for all of the victims suggested by the records in Jeremiah's journals. Based on the entries and the cataloged items in the collection, the actual number of those who fell victim to the Mountain Brothers may exceed 50 individuals over the course of their activities. The majority of these victims remain unnamed and unclaimed, their disappearances perhaps never formally reported or connected to the brothers' activities. A report from the West Virginia State Police Cold Case Unit dated 1967 states, based on journal entries and collected evidence, we estimate that the Thornhill brothers may have been responsible for between 45 and 60 disappearances between 1909 and 1919, with Jeremiah potentially continuing these activities until at least 1943. Of these, only 17 victims have been positively identified through recovered personal effects or other evidence. The remainder constitute a silent population of the missing whose fates, while strongly suspected, cannot be conclusively determined. The mountain trails continued to carry travelers through the passes where the Thornhill brothers once waited. The specific location of their homestead has been deliberately omitted from official maps and historical markers, partly out of respect for the victims and partly due to concerns about attracting curiosity seekers. Nevertheless, local guides report that hikers occasionally inquire about finding the site, drawn by the macabre allure of the case. In 1966, the County Historical Society debated whether to include the Thornhill case in a comprehensive history of the region being prepared for publication. Minutes from their meeting record a heated discussion about the ethics of documenting such events, with some members arguing that the story should be told as a cautionary tale, while others expressed concern about sensationalizing the brothers' crimes. Ultimately, the Society opted to include a brief, factual account, noting only that the Thornhill case of 1919 represented one of the most serious criminal investigations in county history, without providing details that might attract ghoulish interest. The Harrison County Historical Society maintains the sealed records of the case, including copies of the journals and photographs of the evidence. Access is granted only to qualified researchers with legitimate academic or law enforcement purposes. According to the Society's curator, speaking in a 1967 interview, some aspects of this case are too disturbing to enter the public domain. There are details that would serve no historical purpose but would only satisfy morbid curiosity. This policy of restricted access has led to numerous rumors and myths surrounding the case, many of which bear little resemblance to the documented facts. Local folklore has incorporated supernatural elements entirely absent from the historical record, with some versions claiming that the Thornhills practiced witchcraft or were themselves not entirely human. These embellishments perhaps represent a psychological need to place such extreme behavior outside the realm of human possibility. Dr. Samuel Grafton, a cultural anthropologist who studied the evolution of the Thornhill legend in Appalachian communities, noted in a 1969 paper, "The transformation of the Thornhill brothers from human predators to supernatural entities in local folklore represents a common pattern in the cultural processing of extreme deviance. By reimagining the brothers as witches, shapeshifters, or other non-human entities, the community creates a psychological buffer between themselves and the disturbing reality that such individuals emerged from their midst." Perhaps the most disquieting aspect of the Mountain Brothers case is not what was discovered, but what remains unknown. The true extent of their activities, their possible connections to other similar offenders, and, most significantly, whether Jeremiah Thornhill actually survived beyond the final journal entry in 1943, these questions persist without definitive answers. The cave where the final journals were discovered showed signs of having been abandoned for years, but no remains were found that could be definitively identified as Jeremiah's. A report from a forensic team that examined the cave in 1965 noted the absence of identifiable human remains that could be attributed to Jeremiah Thornhill leaves open the possibility that he may have departed the location after his final journal entry. Given his age at the time, approximately 69 years, it seems unlikely that he could have established another operation elsewhere, but the possibility cannot be entirely discounted. In the decades since, the dense forests and hidden valleys of the Appalachian Mountains have continued to guard their secrets. Occasionally, hikers or hunters report discovering unusual stone formations or crudely constructed shelters in particularly remote areas, reminiscent of descriptions in the Thornhill journals. A report filed with the National Park Service in 1958, well before the rediscovery of the Thornhill case, described a hiker's discovery of a strange arrangement of stones in a cleared area approximately 40 miles south of the Blackwell Pass, forming what appeared to be a table or altar-like structure. The report noted that unusual marks or symbols had been carved into several surrounding trees, though no photographs or detailed descriptions of these markings were included. None of these discoveries have been conclusively linked to the brothers, but each one reignites interest in the case and raises the unsettling possibility that some legacy of the Mountain Brothers might persist in the shadows of those ancient hills. A retired park ranger interviewed for a local newspaper in 1967 shared his perspective. These mountains have countless hidden places where a person could live for years without being discovered. Caves, remote hollows, abandoned mining camps. The Appalachians are full of places where someone who knows the terrain could disappear. The question isn't whether it's possible to vanish into these hills, but rather how many have done so over the years, and for what purposes. The last official word on the case came from FBI analyst Robert Thornton, who reviewed the evidence in 1967 as part of a broader study on rural predatory behavior. His conclusion, cited in sealed documents released to the public in 1969, reads, "The Thornhill case represents a rare instance of methodical predation in an environment where social isolation served both as camouflage for the offenders and as a trap for their victims. The combination of geographical isolation, the brothers' understanding of human psychology, and their patience created perfect conditions for their activities. What remains most disturbing is not that such individuals existed, but that they operated undetected for so long, raising the question of how many similar cases might remain undiscovered even today." As of 1969, the official position of the Harrison County Sheriff's Department was that both Thornhill brothers were presumed deceased. However, no death certificates were ever issued, and the case technically remained open, one of the longest-running unsolved cases in West Virginia law enforcement history. A notation in the department's cold case files, dated March 1968, reads simply, "Periodic review continues as required by departmental policy, but no active investigation ongoing due to presumed death of all subjects and the passage of time." The Appalachian region has changed considerably since the time of the Mountain Brothers. Roads have been improved, communities connected, and the deep isolation that once characterized the area has diminished. However, vast stretches of wilderness remain, and even today there are remote areas seldom visited by outsiders. A study conducted by the Appalachian Regional Commission in 1965 identified more than 300 communities across the mountain range that remained accessible only by unpaved roads or trails, many of them miles from the nearest law enforcement presence. The mountains keep their own counsel. The winds that sweep through the passes carry whispers of stories that most prefer not to hear. The roads wind through valleys where shadows linger even at midday, and occasionally travelers passing through the most remote sections of the Appalachian Range report an unusual sensation, the feeling of being observed from just beyond the tree line, the sense that something is evaluating them, measuring their isolation, their vulnerability, their suitability. Local guides and park rangers report that hikers sometimes experience inexplicable anxiety in certain areas, particularly near dusk, when the forest grows quiet and the shadows deepen. A Park Service memo from 1966 notes, "Visitors to the eastern section of the state forest occasionally report feelings of being followed or watched, despite no evidence of other human presence in the area." While likely attributable to normal wilderness anxiety, the consistency of these reports in specific locations is noteworthy. Most continue their journeys without incident, but some perhaps encounter a helpful local who offers directions to a shortcut through the mountains, a path less traveled, that will get them to their destination more quickly. A route that doesn't appear on any map, a trail that winds its way into remote areas where cell phones lose reception, and the only sounds are the whisper of wind through ancient trees and the occasional cry of distant birds. And some of these travelers are never seen again. The mountains keep their secrets, and the legacy of the Thornhill brothers serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who understand not just the terrain, but the psychology of their prey. Those who know how to present themselves as guides and helpers, offering assistance and direction while leading the unwary into situations from which there is no return. As one researcher noted in a final report on the case in 1969, the true horror of the Mountain Brothers lies not in the specifics of their actions, as disturbing as those were, but in the revelation that such methodical predation could occur within the framework of ordinary human interaction. The brothers did not skulk in shadows or present obvious danger signals. They offered rest, food, and guidance to weary travelers. They conversed, traded, and engaged in the normal commerce of human society. And in doing so, they exploited the basic trust that allows communities to function. Perhaps that is their most disturbing legacy, the shadow of doubt cast over the simple act of accepting help from a stranger on a lonely road.